Great. Um, so uh, just to jump right into the science,
Yeah.
um, one of the things that our community really would like to hear more about and get a breakdown of is these mutations. And in our conversation in December, you all had expected that there would be mutations, especially since it's a global pandemic. So we would really like to hear from you. You did such an amazing job of explaining mRNA and the virus that we would love to hear from you. What are these mutations from a scientific perspective?
Yeah. So I want to start by saying that mutations are expected in viruses, right? So viruses, especially RNA viruses. So essentially, a virus is a strand of genetic material. So there are certain bases that are part of this genetic material, and viruses just represent one strand, and that's a code for certain proteins that the virus needs to take over a cell, reproduce itself, move on to the next, right? So, you know, RNA viruses are notorious for making mistakes when they copy themselves. And in fact, this is how from generation to generation, viruses keep up with having some diversity in their strand, right? So if you think about generations of humans, we all have genetic diversity. We get it by mating with other humans, and you're not the same as your grandfather or your great grandfather, right? So viruses do this too. They get genetic diversity generation after generation after generation. A virus generation is very, very short, right? So the likelihood that mutations accumulate is related to how many times viruses can replicate and in how many different hosts they can replicate, right? So when we think about this COVID-19 pandemic, millions of people have been infected. In one person, there are, thousands upon thousands of viral replications, and then it spreads to another person, and that happens again, right? So, this virus has experienced very many generations. And so we expect that over time, the virus would change. Now, most changes in viruses don't actually change the function of the virus, right? For example, you are not the same as your great grandfather. However, you're both still human and you function generally the same way, right? Once a virus starts to, sort of the premise that it's much easier to break something than it is to improve something. Most changes in viruses, most mutations in viruses actually don't change anything that is core to the function of the virus, right? Because if it did, that virus is very likely not able to survive as well as the native virus, right? We even know this in movies, like the sequel is always worse than the first one. It's much easier to break something that's good when you have a good thing going, right? So that principle remains. Now, occasionally, there can be mutations that happen in parts of the virus that are important for its functioning that can improve the likelihood that that virus will survive and will go on to infect other people. And the viral mutations that cause some sort of survival benefit are the ones that end up, competing out all of the other strains of the virus, right? So we've seen this happen a couple of times. One in the UK, one in South America and Brazil, and one in South Africa. So the way that these mutations work is that so if you think of a virus as like a key, right? You could have a heart-shaped key, you could have a circle-shaped key, whatever, as long as the part of the key that fits the lock works, then it's going to work, right? So say there are mutations in like that aesthetic part of the key, if a virus is a key, that's not really going to change anything. However, there can be mutations in the lock part of the key, right? So the part of the virus that's important for it actually entering into, a host's body, right? So for these mutations, like the UK mutation, there's a change in that lock part or the receptor binding region, right? And it makes that part a little bit better at getting into cells than other virus strains, right? So we think what's happening with these mutations is that they are causing the virus to be able to infect people a little bit more easily. So more transmissibility, which means that they're more likely to compete out other viruses, and then the strain sort of starts to take over.
So given that, my first question about these particular viruses, well, one, are they each a little bit different, these
Yes.
mutations? And we've moved away from this. What makes them like born in South Africa? Are they really started there, or did maybe they were in somewhere else and then the one person? So try to understand like how we frame, and how does the science community refer to these mutations?
Sure. So in the science community, we are tracking the exact sequence of the viruses that are picked up, right, that are affecting people. And in fact, we know that these mutations have been happening because remember when we said, oh, this virus started in Wuhan, and then that strain of the virus that ended up in New York came from Europe, and then this strain of the virus that ended up in California came from somewhere in China, right? Like we can track the virus because we know that the virus is mutated at a certain rate. We know the original sort of code of the virus. And if people are tracking the code of the virus many countries over, we know when something picks up some sort of mutation and the sequence that happens, right? So that is just sort of viral taxonomy, and it's been going on this whole time. Now, your point is taken that, could a strain of the virus have arisen in a country that's not really doing the tracking, and then that person ends up in a country that's doing the tracking, and now it's first discovered in that area? Sure, right? But we don't. So like in the UK has one of the most robust systems, and they are sequencing about 10% of people who test positive for coronavirus, right? So again, we're missing a lot of people, and that is in the US, it's dismal. Like there's some on like the West Coast, there's some in New York, but like we're really not picking this up. So, are these viral mutations, coming from those countries? Maybe. It's also possible that a same mutation that increases the likelihood that a virus will survive comes about again in a new place, right? So, we guess that as much as possible. But you're right, it's not a perfect science.
And is there a way to describe it that might be more related to the science than to the country?
Yeah. So there are. So I mean, there are, but I think that's just communicating science to the lay public, right? Like, for example, the strain in the UK is B.1.1.7, right? Nobody wants to say that. It's a lot easier to say the UK strain. That's catchier. Maybe I shouldn't say catchier when talking about a virus, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah. So for sure, kind of like, for example, H1N1, right? That was the swine flu, and it caused a lot of problems because people were like, oh, this comes from pigs, and then pigs farmers had problems, right? So then we started calling it H1N1, right? But now there's so many different strains, it's hard to be like B117 or like, so yes, there are more scientific ways of describing this.
You mentioned, and this may be a really hard question because I know COVID is completely different, but all viruses are expected to mutate, and you all have been tracing mutations for, I don't know, hundreds of years. What is the average rate of a mutation?
Right. So actually, man, now I wrote this down somewhere and I now don't have it, but in like at the top of my head. That said, I will say that coronaviruses tend to mutate slower than other RNA viruses. So coronaviruses actually have proofreading machinery. So one of the proteins that they encode checks back over the code and makes sure that it's okay. So coronaviruses are actually one of the slowest mutating RNA viruses. They mutate much slower than flu viruses, way slower than HIV viruses. So, you know, on the scale of viral mutations, this one is actually going pretty slowly. It's just that so many people have coronavirus in so many countries, and, you know, they're just like literally millions upon millions of opportunities, maybe trillions of opportunities for mutations to happen. And so you end up having them, which is another reason why it's so important to stop transmission and get people vaccinated, because the less it circulates in the population, the less likely we are going to end up with mutations that make this virus much different than the original one.
So that leads me to the next question we have, which is around, so if they're all a little bit different, how does the current vaccines, what's their how do you say the efficacy?
Yes. Yeah, so that's a great question. Because the fear with mutations is that perhaps a virus can mutate such that it, you know, the vaccines no longer work, right? So I'll go back to that lock and key example. There are lots of parts of the virus that our immune responses could target, right? So say there's a key, think of like a key with like a ridiculously large handle on it, right? Like a beach ball handle, but there's only like a little part that actually fits the lock, right? So you could have an immune response that targeted any part of that big beach ball handle, right? But those wouldn't be effective because they wouldn't block that little part that's important for the key to fit the lock and come in, right? So what we do with vaccines is we say, okay, the most important thing to prevent this infection is for the immune response to target just this key part, right? So we take the code only for that key part, and then we say, we're going to feed the immune system the top of the key, the side of the key, the bottom of the key, the middle of the key, right? And so we choose all of these other, like these sites are called epitopes, right? And we feed the code for all of those epitopes to the immune system. And that means that our bodies target all of those different parts, any one of which could, you know, block the key from entering the lock and getting it, right? So because these viruses, so say a virus happened and it mutated every single part of that key, that virus likely wouldn't work, right? Like you can't change everything about the most important part of the virus and it still cause an infection, right? So the vaccines are built with a lot of redundancy. So this is why even though the vaccines were made using the code of the original virus, they're still able to protect us against these variants. The caveat here is that this code is not just like a straight string of genetic material. It's folded, right? And it folds into different conformations, and that conformation may change if the virus is trying to get into a cell versus living in a cell. So the Brazilian variant folds a little bit differently, and so it makes it a little bit harder for the antibodies that people make, either due to infection or due to having had the vaccine, to actually get into that key part, So it looks like, and I think that's also the case with the South African variant. So it looks like the antibody response that we make is a little bit less good at taking out that strain of the virus. The good news is there's something called a cushion effect, right? So, when we give the vaccine, we induce an immune response. So like we make our bodies make antibodies. We make way more antibodies than we need, right? So just to make the math simple, imagine that you need 10 antibodies to be able to attach to the virus in order to prevent an infection. This vaccine makes you make, 10,000 antibodies, right? So even if you're 10% less effective or 20% less effective, you're still much over the threshold that would be necessary to prevent an infection. So far, especially the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines, we're seeing continued efficacy in preventing these infections.
So that leads me to my next question. How would a mRNA booster work? Is
Yes.
that additional instructions to help them get through the folded strains that are a little bit harder to, I guess if we're using the key, to unlock?
Yes. So essentially, say we end up with a strain that's predominant, that is very, very different than the original strains that we use to instruct our vaccines. We could say, okay, there are these new epitopes, right? There are these new parts on the key that we need to make sure we target. So we could then go back and make another mRNA vaccine that included the code for those new parts. And then now we can give that to people and instruct their immune response to make, antibodies to those specific new parts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hope this makes sense, right?
It
makes complete sense. It's awesome. It's really great.
I don't want you guys to be like, what the hell is she talking about?
This makes a lot of sense, but that just led me to a question that I actually never had before, which is it possible, and I don't think it is because I know our bodies are complex, but is it possible to have too many of these types of instructions, like where our body feels, overloaded? Yeah. Like how often can you get a booster? Like, because I hear things, oh, this is going to be every year or every 6 months. And is that healthy?
Right. I mean, in this case, yes. I mean, we get flu shots every year.
Yeah.
Right? And the other thing is mRNA is very, very transient. So anyway, if you've ever worked in a lab with mRNA, like it's the worst thing ever. There are mRNases everywhere. Like mRNA can't wait to go away. Like that's the reason why we have to store it at such a low temperature. So, when you put it in your body, your immune cells are going to pick it up, make a response, and then it's gone, right? So it's not like you're accumulating mRNA over time. The other thing is, so you can actually, and this happens more in native infection. So say you just have like your body's exposed to a whole virus. Sorry, hang on.
That's okay.
I don't know who's there. Anyway.
Marketing.
Yeah. It's always like Amazon people, and they're always ringing me when I.
Oh, that's the door person.
Always. Yeah. Anyway, so where was I? What was I talking about?
In your body, your system be overloaded.
Yes. Okay, so say you get exposed to a whole virus, right? And your body's like, I don't know what part of this is important. I'm gonna just make some antibodies. Okay, your body can make antibodies to non-important parts of that virus, right? So we call those non-neutralizing antibodies. So you can make antibodies to the handle of the key and not really do a lot. The other thing that can happen with those is you can have like a paradoxical response. So like you make antibodies to the wrong part of the virus, and those antibodies essentially rev up your immune system, and this over exuberant immune response ends up hurting you, or worse, facilitating the virus getting into your cells and infecting you, right?
Would that be the very few cases of the allergic reactions, Bell palsy, etc.? How did they manifest?
Okay, yeah, so that's a little bit different. So the allergic reactions, we think that the allergic reactions are to one of the additives in the vaccines. Okay. You can't just give naked mRNA, it would disintegrate immediately. So the mRNA is housed in like these little fat bubbles called liposomes. Some people have allergic reactions to liposomes. So there are other medications that we give in liposomes, and like some people just have allergic reactions to that. There's actually I think yesterday, the CDC came out with an extended safety report that showed that allergic reactions, so 4.5 people for every 1 million people who get the vaccine have allergic reactions. So actually very, very low. Mm-hmm. So allergic reaction is a little bit different. Bell's palsy also different. So Bell's palsy is related to an inflammatory response. So, everybody you have like a facial nerve comes across your face like that. It's one of the cranial nerves. And like it comes past a lot of lymph tissue. And so if you have an immune response and like that lymph node or the salivary gland gets filled up with inflammatory cells, that inflammatory response can injure the nerve. And then you can end up having like a transient Bell's palsy, right? That happens in any number of viral infections or, inflammatory conditions. It hasn't been shown that that's more likely to happen in people who are vaccinated.
Back to the booster question. I hadn't thought of this until you explained the science so well. So if you get the Johnson & Johnson, which is not an mRNA vaccine, can you then get an mRNA booster?
That's actually an interesting question because, and I'm not sure that I know the official answer to that, because for the vaccine course, we're recommending, if you get Pfizer the first dose, you get Pfizer the second dose, you get, so whether or not people who need boosters can get a different kind of booster. I mean, I would suspect yes. I'm not sure any reason why not, but also that's based on conjecture.
Well, I would think it would too, because even if it's just a message thing, even though the other Johnson & Johnson's more of you're giving, as you explained, a little bit of the virus or dead virus, that it's still, it's more about the coding, but you're the scientist, so I'm happy to hear you had the same conclusion.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. So
this has been so helpful.
Okay. I
feel like no matter how many times I hear the science of virus strains, mutations, I learn something new each time. And I'm like, oh, wow. And I have like a whole new set of questions after that. So I just want to double back. So you explained so wonderfully the allergy and the very few number of allergic reactions to the vaccines and Bell's palsy. But what would be a physical manifestation of what you were describing, if not those?
Okay, so that would be people who just get very, very sick with the virus. So say, the virus is able to spread throughout their bodies and their cells very well. This antibody mediated enhancement would be, well, that person's own immune response is allowing the virus to get into their cells more easily. Or somebody gets extremely sick and they have pneumonia, their lungs fill up with pus and their, inflammatory response is out of control. That would be antibodies, non-neutralizing antibodies causing this excessive immune response, right? I mean, that was described in one of the SARS viruses. It was not described in this one. So not in SARS-CoV-2. But there's some evidence that SARS and MERS, there was some antibody mediated enhancement.
So these strands are more contagious, but what we understand, that doesn't necessarily mean they're more deadly.
Right. So, and that's a complicated thing to think about, right? Because they're more transmissible, meaning given that you have the virus, you're more likely to affect. So I think, so there's a concept called R naught, right? Like given that one person has the virus, how many people do you expect that person to then infect, right? The R naught for the variant is higher. So that means that you expect a person who is infected to then go on to infect about 50% more people, right? I mean, if you expect that person to infect 1 or 2 people, 50% more is like half a person on average, right?
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I mean, it sounds crazy, but not really if you're talking about a low number, right? And that gets to the point that it depends on what you're talking about. Risk is always risk relative to what, right? Say everyone wears an awesome fitting mask and we expect one person who has an infection to infect half a person on average, right? 50% more is still less than a person on average, right? If we are not social distancing, we're not wearing masks very well, right? And you expect one person to infect 3 other people. Well, 50% more is a person and a half on average, right? So again, it's related to how the virus spreads, but it's also related to what we do, right?
Which are we ready to move on to the
Yeah,
receiving the vaccine?
I was gonna say, I really want to hear about your experience. I know the last time we were on the verge of getting your first dose. So now that you probably received the first, second, I want to hear all the stories of your own symptoms, what you were feeling when you finally got in that chair, and all of that. That would be great to hear.
That's a story. So it's interesting, the first dose of the vaccine, I was very emotional. I felt really thankful. I felt like, I finally made it to this milestone. Here I was, the virus hit and it was scary, and I was taking care of patients, and I didn't know if I was going to get sick and bring it home to my significant other, so like living with that chronic fear for a whole year, and then finally getting vaccinated, I felt like I just like crossed the finish line. I just felt so fortunate. The second dose also felt very fortunate. I also had some side effects. So no, I never felt like, oh, I wish I didn't get the second dose. They were manageable side effects, but so I got the vaccine about maybe after my workday. So I got it maybe around like 4:30 p.m. and I felt fine. Actually, I didn't even have arm pain, and I was like, oh, this is easier than the first one, right? And then by maybe 8 or 9 p.m., my arm started hurting. Ended up going to bed, and then I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning with like more severe arm pain and some chills and some like subjective fever and just headache and muscle ache, right? I did go to work. And then like by mid-morning, I was like, this is a bad idea. So I ended up going home, and I felt really tired. I had like this brain fog. It's interesting because I take care of lupus patients, and lupus patients always say, oh, I have this brain fog. It's hard for me to concentrate on anything. And I don't think that I had ever experienced that firsthand until I got this vaccine, and I'm like, oh, this is what they're talking about, right? So it's hard for me to really focus on things. But I ended up taking some Tylenol PM, so like Tylenol with a little Benadryl in it, and then a little bit of ibuprofen, and I took a nap. And then I woke up around like 5 p.m., 6 p.m. And I felt just some brain fog, but the muscle aches had gone away, and the headache and all of that had gone away. So, I still had meetings, but after that, I was totally fine. Yeah.
Which vaccine did you receive, and when did you find out which vaccine you would be receiving? Was it in the chair or was it before?
It was in the chair, and I got the Pfizer vaccine. Wow. I wanted the Moderna vaccine.
I know. So that
because of Kizzy, PhD, I was like, yes, like my sis has made this vaccine, and actually my significant other got the Moderna. So Kizzy, shout out to Kizzy. She did help our family. But yeah, I got the Pfizer one. So
one of the questions I had was, so we have been hearing a lot about some side effects like you described.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that the vaccines are working differently, and that there are more side effects with men or women?
So not necessarily. So the report that came out, which is a summary of vaccine adverse event reporting, if you go to the CDC website, you can get it. Actually, I posted a summary on my Twitter page, so at Ashira MD, you guys can look. But in any case, so interestingly, there were more reports from women. So like, but it's a passive system, so you can never really know, right? Women, we are very responsible, right? Somebody asks us what we think, we're going to say it. So, you know, it was 60, 70% of the reported adverse events came from women. But again, you know, there were what, about 14 million vaccines were given out in the month surveillance period that they reported on. 7,000 adverse events were reported, so that's 0.05%. And most of those, 90+% of them, were these mild side effects, like what I said.
And if you don't have side effects, does it mean that is the vaccine still working?
Yes, yeah. So again, the vaccine was about 95% effective, right? So even in people, and in this report, interestingly, for the Pfizer second dose, 78% of the people who gave reports said that they had some side effect like this, right? So it's very common for people to have these side effects, probably more than half of people. However, the efficacy is still 95%. So it doesn't mean that it didn't take if you don't get the side effects. You're just lucky.
Anecdotally, sorry, Mary, anecdotally, what were your partner's side effects?
So he only has the first dose, and like his arm hurt, and that was it. Okay. So I'll let you guys know how he feels with the second dose. Yeah.
I forget what I was going to ask. It was about the vaccines dosage. Oh, I know what it was. So in terms of, you know, back in December, there wasn't a lot of information or scientific data research on women who are pregnant. Is there any new information about that?
So there will be very soon. So there are two ways that the CDC collected information. One of them was just the passive report, but they also, in about 1.5 million people, they offered them this self-enrollment. So if they had smartphones, they got the vaccine, they could enroll in this VC. So those people got surveys every day for a week. And then they also got another survey at week 3 and then week 6 to see how they did and if there were any side effects. So only 800,000 of those people, you know, chose to actually take the survey. Unsurprisingly, 70% of them were women because we carry the world on our backs. But yeah, so about 10,000 of those people were pregnant. And about 200 people, 260 had a positive pregnancy test during the surveillance period. So that cohort of women will be tracked over time. There was no, in the report, they didn't mention whether or not the pregnant women reported more or fewer side effects or anything like that. But we are assured in the report that that data is forthcoming.
That's a nice size number of people.
Yeah, it's a good number of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that gives me, I mean, I feel, if you think about the overall trials, the clinical trials, there were 30,000 people in each trial, and like half or 2/3, I think, got the vaccine versus, you know, didn't. So a sample size of, you know, 10, 11,000 is actually very good.
Did you want to ask a question about breast milk?
Yeah, so it's interesting. My best friend is a ER physician here in Atlanta, and she gave birth in November and received both doses of the vaccine probably in January, and she's now back at work, but she's breastfeeding. And so we were talking about this last weekend, and she said, I have tons of breast milk. I wonder if my newborn baby has the antibodies and if I should be giving it. She's also has a 4-year-old. And if I could give the milk to the 4-year-old. And so what do we know about that? Like, is it milk?
So I don't, again, that data is not really out there. If I had to suspect, I would think that you would not have antibodies in the breast milk. The reason for that is that breast milk, there are different kinds of antibodies, right? So there are antibodies that are predominantly in the blood, like IgG and IgM and IgE, and they have all different effects. But the ones that are secretory, meaning the ones that end up in our secretions, like our saliva and our gut and our breast milk, are IgA antibodies. We make those most strongly when our mucosal surfaces, like the inside of our nose or our mouth, are exposed to a pathogen. And then the immune response starts there. When you stick a needle in someone's arm, you're going to induce an IgG, IgM, IgE immune response, but not necessarily an IgA response. That's actually why, there's a flu shot that you can like inhale, like so one of the benefits of that kind of a shot or that kind of a vaccination is that it induces an IgA response, right? So I would, just based on my scientific knowledge, I would expect there not to be much in the way of antibodies in breast milk after you get vaccinated. But I'm sure that study is ongoing.
Well, that's really interesting.
It's super interesting. So I'd like to move on to the rollout. There's been a lot of noise and it's hard to make sense of anything. So coming from the scientific community that I know that is working so hard to get everyone vaccinated, can you shed any light on the issues with the rollout?
Yeah. So I am actually, I do not appreciate the way that this rollout is happening. There are lots of issues with equity. And I am getting extremely annoyed with all of the reports talking about how Black and brown people don't want the vaccine. However, we are not distributing the vaccine equitably. I think what we have to understand is that trust is a very grassroots organic process. So if you are of a community that is culturally congruent with most health experts and most of the talking heads that are coming out saying this vaccine is safe, you're probably more trustful just on that word. However, in Black and brown communities, we don't have a lot of culturally congruent representatives. So that means that we are most likely to be trustful when someone that we know and love, who's comfortable getting vaccinated, gets vaccinated and then tells us how they did, right? So the more that we are able to vaccinate people who want it, who are of diverse communities, the more we increase trust and the more that we increase the population of people of all backgrounds who are willing to get it. The New York State Department of Health is publishing information on who's getting vaccinated by demographic. Of the eligible people who are white, 70% of those people have gotten vaccinated. Of the eligible people who are African American, 17% have gotten vaccinated. That's ridiculous. There's not that big of a difference in the likelihood that someone wants to be vaccinated. That is a problem with distribution. And it really, really has to be remedied. And I think that, what I was really afraid of, and I don't know if I said this before, but what I was afraid of was that this narrative that Black and brown people don't want the vaccine would be so loud. And then when people didn't get vaccinated, we would blame it on the people themselves, right? The quote, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say that you enjoyed it. It's that all over again, because there are lots of people who want it, but they're not being offered it. So, there are a lot of problems with, the vaccine being distributed to these sort of ivory tower, medical facilities, hospitals, academic centers, right? That's not reaching out into the community. Being distributed, the appointments are being made via smartphones or online appointments. People who don't have access to that technology are less likely to be able to make an appointment or know where to go. language barrier issues. A lot of this is in English language. People who don't, who speak other languages, or, or are literate in other languages, or people who are frankly are illiterate, are not going to be able to get it as well. And then for some reason, we're doing this rollout in like just large, like, like stadiums and things like that. And so you're asking people to come out in a pandemic and stand in a line with a bunch of other people to get this vaccine. I mean, that's very inconvenient. It's, arguably not safe in the middle of a pandemic, right? Like that also creates barriers. We really need to figure out how to get this vaccine in community centers, in manageable hubs, so that people aren't having to go through this Herculean effort just to get vaccinated.
Just like they make it really difficult to vote.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
And then blame people for not voting.
And blame people for not voting. Right. Those people, and don't even get me started, but all these counties that like, we're all like, oh, thank God these people voted, and now we have this changeover in government and things can happen. Do you know what was done to those communities? Like all of the voting booths that were taken away, all of the hours that they had to spend in line, like the barrier to access was high, and they did it anyway. And instead of rewarding people for that kind of thing, we still create structures that make other life-saving interventions like vaccination more challenging. It's really just disgusting, honestly.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, where's New York? Because we understand that, the lack of support with distribution from the federal government in terms of the plan. A lot of this is falling on the state. Some states, New York, where you are, have more capacity and more infrastructure to handle something of this nature than a lot of others. But New York still faces a lot of challenges. Transportation, as you're saying, a large subset of people who not only speak English, but a different language, all of the issues, a large homeless population. What's the scene on the ground in New York? Where is New York in terms of the phases? Most places are 1A.
Yeah. I think we're 1B. And February 15th, we just opened up vaccination of people with chronic illnesses, including autoimmune conditions. So we're going through the phases pretty quickly, but I still think that we need a better plan for ensuring health equity. Yeah. I will say, my partner is a veteran, and so he was able to go to the Bronx VA, and the Bronx VA is the only VA site that was offering it to a wider range of veterans. That said, the email came out, and it was an email, and they said, if you can come on this day and stand in this line for this long, you can get vaccinated, right? So again, it's another one of those things where it's like, how high are you willing to jump for this? Yeah.
The question was about rollout. What can we do as a community?
Yeah, so I think that grassroots again, right? I think that we have to, I think that we need to make sure that we're telling our communities as much as we can how they can get the vaccines, and helping people sign up, and spreading the information. Those of us who have should spread it to those who don't have. And then even I think in Massachusetts, there was a program where if you were taking someone who was 75 or older to get the vaccine and you were younger, that you could also get vaccinated, right? And that facilitates our own, understanding that we're all very self-interested. That facilitates people, making sure that people who are vulnerable get the vaccine. Now, we could just do that anyway. So, I think that will be important. And then hopefully, churches, community centers will implement to try and make sure that the most vulnerable among us are able to get vaccinated.
Yeah, this was an issue that I was ranting about in terms of just access to information when we were around testing, because there were these, and to me, it didn't make sense. There were these websites that you'd go to and then you'd try to make an appointment and there was no appointments for weeks. And I was just like, it's so easy. Make a TikTok, you
Right.
know, like here are all the ways and how you go about it. And it's like, if they really want people to get vaccinated, they will find ways to get the information out in a way that everybody can understand it. But it's a lack of really.
And this is the thing that doesn't make sense to me, because like when the pandemic was going on, New York State had all of these programs to prevent food insecurity, right? And I would get these emergency alerts on my phone automatically sent about where to go to get food, or even when there's a snowstorm and there's an emergency alert that you shouldn't be driving, like that comes to my phone automatically. Yep. We have the infrastructure, right? Why make someone jump through hoops, figure out where to go and what site and all that? Like, couldn't we just tell people?
Mm-hmm. Geolocators, you're near a site.
Right. Like, yeah, it's a whole mess.
Well, this has been amazing. Tiffany, do you have any more questions for Dr. Blazer?
No, this has been, so enlightening. Again, every time we speak with you, we not only feel empowered because we leave understanding the science and understanding how, we can arm ourselves with knowledge, but you make it so simple that it's not intimidating. I feel like I could just now go read the reports myself and I have like some baseline knowledge to then understand. I want to understand everything, but it makes me want to go, like, I'm not going to let go of the breast milk question. Like, I'm going to go look it up and I'm going to make sure we follow the science. But if I have questions, I'll email you.
For sure. I'm really glad.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking time on your Saturday to help explain all of this very complicated science, but it really inspiring. And I hope that all people get inspired to dig deeper and potentially go into the sciences, because it is so cool.
It is very cool. And we need people, especially Black and brown people, and especially women.
Yes.
So, all right.
Thanks again. And just quickly, did you receive the calendar?
Yes, I did. I did.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. I wanted to make sure, because
yes, I did. That was very sweet.
Yeah, that was a labor of love from our community, people who we reached out to do these pieces of artwork. So I'm glad you received it.
Yeah, thank you for sending it.
All right. Well, you have a wonderful rest of the day. Yes.
You too.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.